Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the second webinar of Carl's Inclusive Collections series, Diversity Statements and Collection Policies, which has been organized by Carl's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I'm Julie Mora, a Senior Program Officer at Carl. Before we begin, please note that simultaneous translation into French and English is available for this session and can be accessed using the interpretation icon in the bottom right corner of your Zoom window. Une traduction simultanée en français et en anglais est disponible pour cette session et est accessible via l'icône d'interprétation.
Simultaneous interpretation is available during this webinar. To access it, just click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window.
Speakers and attendees are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. My home and the Carl office, located here in Ottawa, are built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We welcome you to add your own acknowledgements into the chat and to honor and recognize the ongoing contributions of the First Peoples of these lands. I'd also like to take this opportunity to go over the logistics for the session. So links to the Carl Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread, and organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact Susan Haig, Carl Executive Director, whose contact information has also been listed in the chat. Our speakers will be taking questions at the end. You may ask questions in French or English, either by entering them into the chat or by raising your hand when prompted. Finally, auto-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded. Now I'd like to invite our speakers to introduce themselves and lead our discussion today.
Thank you very much, Julie. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session called Diversity Statements in Collection Development Policies. I'm Catherine Lachaîne. I will be joined with my colleague, Ryan and Marta today. We're going to do a quick introduction in a minute. I can go to the next slide. I know that Julie just did her own acknowledgement, but we would like to add our own. So we would like to acknowledge that the land on which this research was done is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Anishinaabe peoples. We embrace that these lands are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and hope that the work we do helps libraries take steps towards reconciliation and honors the land and its Indigenous heritage. So quickly, the team, so Marta from the St. Paul University, so she's collection development and liaison librarian. She's also the lead of this project. I'm Catherine, I'm the open education librarian in an interim position right now at the University of Ottawa Library. And we're joined with Ryan Rivando, who's newly the sales representative, sales manager in Canada at Paradigm Publishing Services. This project is supported by St. Paul University internal research funding. And one thing that we also wanted to add, you can see we're all white people. So we want to mention that we are not the kind of representatives or leaders of this conversation. So we want to acknowledge the privilege we have to undertake this research as white settlers, cisgender, and able individuals. So we recognize that this is a sensible topic, and again, that we're not the representatives or leaders of this discussion. So we welcome any comments, concern, questions from today's participant, but it was important to acknowledge that. Quickly, what we'll do today during this session, so we'll talk about this project. So this is based on the research project that we undertook now 2 years ago now. We'll do a brief literature review on the topic, talk about our methodology, and then the bulk of our session will be on the study results and also discussion. So now we'll give the mic to Marta.
So we will ask you to work a little bit with us. So we'll have several interactions during the session. So this is our first one. This is using Slido. So you can join it either through slido.com and enter the number you see on the screen, or you can scan the QR code that you see and vote this way. So the first question is, are you involved in collection development decisions at your institutions? So we'll give you a few seconds to vote, and we'll have several of the Slido interactions throughout the session. So again, please scan the QR code if you have a phone handy, or you can go to slido.com and enter the numbers 2275159. Okay, we have about 20 people who have voted already. We'll give it a little bit, a few more minutes. Okay, so we have about 50% of our participants involved directly with the selecting and acquiring materials. That's great to hear. We have several, 25%, who oversee the collection development process but don't selecting materials themselves. 11% provide input or recommendations, and then we have 7% in both categories where people are not involved in collection development at all. Thank you so much for voting. This is great. So this allows us to actually know our audience, and it's great to have you all here. So why did we decide to do this research? In 1930, Francis Drury established 21 book selection principles, and one of which states that the high purpose of book selection is to provide the right book for the right reader at the right time. This principle closely echoes how we do collection development today. However, is this enough? Academic libraries are often described as a beacon of diversity and inclusion. For example, Cruz in 2019 stated that diversity is a cornerstone of the library profession. As libraries navigate in a society that is inherently racist, unjust, and oppressive, it is crucial to critically examine libraries' collection policies and practices, and whether these policies and practices contribute to inequality, marginalization, and injustice. In fact, this active and critical self-reflection is essential to combat the path of neutrality. The process of decolonizing library collection is essential to also combat traditional Eurocentric focus by focusing on intentionally acquiring materials. Thus, this research stems from the pressing need to understand if and how collection development policies of academic libraries in Canada represent the EDII language and how it aligns with the professional practice of academic librarians. Before we proceed, we wanted to define the EDII language. And so we have adopted the definitions provided by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Here you can see the definition of equity, diversity, and inclusion as provided by Shirk. And in addition, we also included the definition of indigenization, decolonization from the Pulling Together BC Campus Guide to Decolonization by Cool and colleagues. And so I'm not going to read all of this definition, but you can have them on the slide. But I wanted to acknowledge that we will be using EDI and EDII language interchangeably because many institutions do not have mention of indigenization when they talk about EDI. And other terms that we have found in the literature are GEDI, IDEA, DEII, DID, and all of them are going to be used interchangeably in this presentation. When it comes to collection development, and based on the definitions of EDII concepts, we would like to establish what does EDII means in collection development. So it means building library collections with a consistent consideration of multiple voices from the community, taking into account race, color, ethnic origin, immigration status, social status, religious views, gender expression, sexual orientation, age, and physical or learning abilities, etc., by providing equitable access and representation of these voices in order to include users' needs as the focal point of the collection and dismantle colonial ideologies. But why do we look at the collection development policies? So first, before we proceed, let's define collection development. So collection development is a systematic assessment of selection and deselection of the library resources. It helps library staff to meet collection goals as they relate to the mission of the library, and it also informs the library's clientele about the principles by which materials are selected for inclusion. Those of you who do collection development know that we operate based on relevance of the resources to the curriculum, currency, and anticipated use. The policies play an important role in our practice as well. So according to Carmark 2021, policies establish priorities and command practice. So it is imperative that libraries take on collection development of take on the development of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their collection development policies. So based on this, our research question for this project was, how do collection development policies of academic libraries in Canada reflect the elements of the EDII framework? Now we're going to talk a little bit about the literature review findings.
Oui, donc une très brève recension de la littérature, donc quelques
This was a quick literature review and a few findings.
Donc vraiment les concepts
Here are some fundamental concepts that we found in the literature, such as social justice, marginalization. Bear with me, I still with the pop-up. Inequalities, marginalization, injustice, and decolonization. Scientific literature on EDI is more and more widespread, but within collection development policies for libraries is still an emerging concept. You'll see the dates of the different articles cited here, which are quite recent. In the current literature, EDI and EDII, the extra I for indigenization, and collection development is a matter of social justice. Therefore, it's important to examine in a critical way our different collection development policies and determine if these policies and practices contribute to inequality, marginalization, and injustice of certain marginalized groups. A more recent idea and concept is decolonizing library collections. Bloom and Willens in 2020 state that it's essential work to combat a traditionally Eurocentric practice in collections by focusing on the deliberate or intentional acquisition of materials. A recent publication of Jones et al. Suggests that practices evolve towards an intentional practice that goes beyond the white voices and focuses on better understanding the needs of our diversified communities on campus. To implement this decolonization practice, we have to make audits. We should review our current collections to understand our collections and also to reaffirm that our collections can be very Eurocentric, very white-focused, and not very diversified. The importance of an EDI framework in our collection development policies is reaffirmed in the literature. This allows librarians to develop collections taking into account the needs on the campus, focused on the library users that are more and more diversified. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to just quickly give an overview of our project stages and the methods that we use to analyze the data that we collected. Okay, so in stage one, this included an environmental scan and creating a repository of collection development policies. So during this phase, some of the areas we investigated were whether EDII statements were present at an institutional, library, or collection development policy levels. We also collected additional data related to these institutions to create a snapshot of that landscape, such as student population, languages, that kind of thing. And then during stage two, we performed a thematic analysis of the collection development policies. So for this, we created a set of codes and tagged relevant text within the collection development policies using the software in vivo. This allowed us to see the trends and relationships for specific criteria across all of the policies. So now I'm just going to go over the study results in this section. Next slide. So yeah, first we'll do a quick overview of the environmental scan. So in addition to gathering the collection development policies, we harvested data about each Canadian university library and their institution. The goal here was to develop a data set that could help us answer questions regarding, as I mentioned, student population, location, languages of instruction, and a long list of other things. When examining the data from the environmental scan, we found a significant commitment to EDI principles, but the main focus from the textual analysis will examine whether collection development policies are keeping pace. So next, I'm going to take a minute to give a couple of examples of what we took away from this data. The aim is to illustrate the type of relationships that we hope to identify and ways we tried to inform the textual analysis. So is there a commitment to EDII principles at Canadian universities? The short answer is yes. At the time of the scan, we found that 76% of Canadian universities have published a statement on their website that explicitly supports EDI principles at their institutions. The next image. The next graph here represents the institutional EDII statements by the official language of the institution. So you'll see here that 76% of the English institutions have an EDI statement, 94% of French institutions have one, and 50% of bilingual. Okay, so how often did the university EDI statements mention libraries? So you'll see here only 2, unfortunately, of the 110 universities that we examined mention libraries in their EDI statement. So libraries need to explore ways to make their own statement. Next. So I just want to give you those 2 mentions quickly. So the first one, I'm not going to read them because they're right there on the screen for you. But what we can see is that they mentioned decolonizing the collection and then also taking action on the addition of indigenized subject headings. The second one from University of PEI. They call for an increase of resources related to groups who are historically underrepresented in library collections. Next slide. So do libraries make commitments to EDII principles? Some do, but not many. We found that 15 out of 110 university libraries in Canada have an EDI statement on their website. This was at the time of the study. So when cross-referencing our data, we also found an interesting correlation between EDI statements on university websites and EDI library statements. So from 84 universities that included an EDII statement, 17% also included an EDI statement from the library. And from 26 institutions who do not have an EDI university level statement, only 4% of those libraries had an EDI statement. So this indicates that organizational culture could possibly play a role in fostering the commitment to EDI principles across the different parts of institutions. So EDI is a term that we came across in our research, though we did not find specific mention of this complete term in any of the collection development policies that we looked at. We think that, especially within Canada, it would be even more impactful commitment to include indigenization as part of EDI statements in collection development policies. So 45% of university EDI statements that mention indigenization and 60% of library EDI statements mention Indigenous issues. So this points to an awareness of the need for steps towards reconciliation in universities and academic libraries. And we think it would be impactful to extend this language into collection development policies. I think this is your slide, Marta.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So to put things in a perspective, let's look at the bigger picture here. So while 79% of the higher education institutions in Canada have EDI statement on their website, 13% of institutional library statements have separate EDI commitment on their website. So you can see that from all the university statements, in 76%, only 13% of the library statements were available. When it comes to collection and development policies, we have found only 2 policies, so 1.8%, that contain explicit EDI statement, but we have also found that 20% of the institutions contain references to diversity, so diversity of users and collections, equity, specifically equal access, and inclusive spaces. We also wanted to see whether they, We also found a correlation between EDII language and how recently the policies were updated. As you can see from this graph, language on diversity and equity starts to become more prevalent in the collection development policy starting in around 2015. Similarly, the concept of indigenization, decolonization, does not appear in policies prior to 2015. So we can see the correlation between the time the policy was last updated and the concept that we have discovered within the policies based on our textual analysis. Here we have another interaction. So we would like to ask you, what key concepts or principles do you believe should guide the integration of EDII in the collection development policies? So this is a word cloud. So if you can respond with one word or maybe, a small phrase, that would be helpful. So we'll give maybe 2-3 minutes for this interaction. Have inclusive by design. Excellent. We have several communities, so communities consultation, communities collaboration, accessibility, intentional commitment to listening to communities. Very good. Measure, intention, expansive, sustainability. Okay, you can add more than one. Listening. So we see communities a lot. We see collaboration a lot. That's great. Best practices for long-term sustainability. That's great. Keep them coming. Publisher diversity, include independent small publishers. Excellent. That's great. Get to know literature of the subject you collect in. Beautiful. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting to see what you think about the topic. So now we want to actually show you what themes we have discovered. So let's look at some of those findings from the thematic analysis of our collection development policies of Canadian university libraries. So during the textual analysis, we have found several major themes in collection development policies and used thematic analysis to code the themes in NVivo software. We have then applied the codes in NVivo to collection development policies we found on the following themes. So EDII, so we wanted to look at the direct mentioned that specifically use those concepts. Then we looked at the indirect mention, so any references to diversity in either languages, in formats, in topics, etc. We also wanted to look at the user needs. So how do policies address the needs of the library users? Faculty community recommendations were included in that as well. Academic freedom, which is really interesting. I don't think it was mentioned. So references to the academic freedom and Bill of Rights, that was really important for us as well. We looked at accessibility, so references to AODA standards and accessible collections. And then we looked also at cultural awareness, so flexibility to respond to the cultural and social needs of the university community, which closely correlated to the user needs as well. Ryan, up to you.
Thank you. Okay, so EDI statements in collection development policies. How many make an explicit statement on EDI? Does anyone want to just pop a couple of guesses in the chat? I'm just curious what the community here might think. How many collection development policies explicitly mention EDI?
And I've put a note earlier, but the scan was done during the fall of 2022. So the data that we're presenting now, we know that it's already a little bit outdated, but not much. But again, it's 2022. So
yeah, so a very few, 3, 5. Marta, do you want to show them how many it was?
Absolutely, yes.
2. So yeah, very few or less is correct. So yeah, unfortunately, we only found 2. So those 2 examples are here. You can see that Brandon University actively seeks to include equitable, diverse, accessible, and inclusive content, while Western Libraries is committed to the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And these were the 2 most explicit commitments that we found. In these statements, we see language that clearly shows that these libraries have identified the need to make commitments to EDI, whether that be related to material selection, community involvement, or the values of the organization. We'll see that in the textual analysis that the language within the collection development policies, that although the individual terms of EDI are used, the context is not the same. Next slide. So in our preliminary results, we'd like to focus on EDI concepts used in the collection development policies, as well share the context in which they were used. Thus, the direct mentions within the collection development policies for equity, were 14%. That includes things like equitable access. For diversity, in reference to students or content, that was 18%. Inclusion, specifically inclusive spaces, that kind of thing was mentioned in only 2% of collection development policies. And lastly, but not least, indigenization. So that could be indigenous pedagogies, decolonial perspective in content, that kind of thing, mentioned in 12% of policies. So that was the individual mentions. So here are some examples of how diversity is being incorporated into some of the collection development policies that we analyzed. So to promote the growth of diverse quality content in library collections by collecting materials from decolonial perspectives and diverse voices. And a second example here is the library's mission is to provide easy access to a diverse and dynamic scholarly collection of material in support of the research, teaching, and learning at the university. So it mentions that use diversity to describe voices and decolonial perspectives are great examples of EDI principles, but the majority of mentions which reference diverse collections or diverse formats, those don't really work to inform EDI practice. So very few university library collection development policies mention equity. And when they do, it focuses on equitable access. So here's a couple of examples. The library's aim is to provide a balanced, equitable access to materials in a multi-campus environment. And a second example is the library is committed to providing equitable, barrier-free access to our collection in accordance with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So additionally, 45% of collection development policies from Ontario academic libraries reference the AODA. And we found that accessibility has been mentioned by over 30% of collection development policies that we examined. So next, the term inclusion has been directly mentioned only 5 times, and it mostly refers to inclusive spaces. So here's a couple of examples of that. Library users will have access to library collections with no discrimination based on racialized identity, gender identity or expression, cultural or ethnic background, ability, family status, age, and political or religious beliefs and views. In cases such as this, we applied inclusion directly because the term inclusion was not often used, but was referenced in other ways like we see in this example. Okay, indigenization language is related to promoting reconciliation. However, it's also underrepresented in collection development policies. Here's one example of indigenization language, which talks about incorporating Indigenous way of knowing into the collection development practices. So the library is dedicated to working toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, understanding the importance of acknowledging the past and calling attention to present challenges. The library commits to incorporating principles of Indigenous ways of knowing into building our collections, as well as the provision of library services to the wider university community.
So now let's discuss a little bit other related themes of EDII language in collection development policies. Oops, sorry. So here we can see that the mention of accessibility, Bill of Rights, academic freedom, the role of librarians, user needs. And so this has been confirmed in other topics that I just mentioned. So you can see that we see a correlation between those universities that don't have EDI statements and those universities who contain the EDI statements. So the difference is quite large between both of them. And so this further confirms that there might be a possible correlation between organizational culture and EDII language across different institutional units.
Donc maintenant, pour notre brève conclusion.
Now for our short conclusion.
Donc, en ce moment, avec les résultats
As we speak, with the findings of our environmental scan, we can see that the collection development policies in Canadian academic institutions have very little language on equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigenization, and don't necessarily have clear statements on this. Many institutions don't have up-to-date collection development policies.
There's a lot of institutions that, like, the wording was not there just because the policies were so old. I think we found the oldest was like from 2000. So that might be a reason why we don't see this language integrated. Mais donc, la date de publication est,
So the policy publication date is important, and there's a correlation between the last update of the policy and the language. Most EDII statements in universities don't mention library development policies, library collection development policies. You can see that the statements are often at the institution level, but the collection development policy doesn't have its own statement. Furthermore, there are other influencing factors, such as having a statement or not at the institution level, the size of the institution, the location, and relations with indigenous communities. So there are several factors that can influence this. Our finding is that there's still a lot of work to be done at that level. We wanted to close with a recent example. I mentioned that our scan was performed in 2022. Since then, my own institution has renewed its collection development policy in January 2024. There are some clear guidelines on the institution's engagement towards equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Feel free to add about the process. We'll have a moment for discussion, but I wanted to present that as a new example. Donc, dans la politique, il est mentionné que les membres de l'équipe.
In the policy, it is mentioned that team members will make an effort to develop an inclusive collection and adopt a flexible approach in the selection criteria to make sure that underrepresented groups are included and represented in the library collection. And there is a clear connection to the EDI guideline. There will be recommendations for an active practice in order to make sure that the library collection represents our indigenization, decolonization, anti-racist, equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion principles.
They're in French, but we can also share in English. So this is publicly available online. So giving that example, taking that example and keeping it in mind, we can go to the next slide. So seeing that it's all great, but there's still a lot of questions and things to reflect on. For example, does the practice align with the EDII principles? So as we've just shown with the UOttawa example, but also from other institutions, the real hands-on practice doesn't align with the EDII principle. How? What are the expectations regarding the use of the inclusive collection and development policy, etc. Next, click. Also, how do library users feel about their collection? How do you integrate the user's voice into the collection development process? And we saw some of you mentioned that in the slide earlier. The community is really important, but how do we integrate their voices? And also in terms of adopting a principle or statement like these, how can the library and the librarians hold themselves accountable for inclusive collection development policies? So these are all questions that just to keep in mind. We still have time for discussion, so we'll have time to explore them, but we have one last slide over here. So what does an ideal inclusive collection look like to you, and how can we start working toward that vision? So you can keep in mind the question that I just mentioned, or things that we said, an example that you saw. So what for you would be ideal?
Also, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to share.
Yeah, dynamic, very wide-ranging. It's like you sortir des sentiers battus. So, we can be creative, expanding our perspective, cross-cultural understandings. Yes, inspires. Yeah, not just sexy right now. I think that's a good point. Like, and this is the whole purpose also of this research, is like, we know that EDI, it's à la mode, it's all sexy right now, everybody's talking about it, but really, even if we put a statement on, in our policy, like in practice, like really, we need to do the work, the real work. Yeah, we see some of these typing. We'll wait a minute, and then we'll kind of conclude and open the floor for more, discussion, because we know that a lot of you are doing collection development, so we probably have a lot of experience with that type of work, or would like to learn more about others' experiences. Yeah, bake into our daily work. It's an ongoing daily work, something that we need to keep in mind on a daily basis. Who benefits when we invest in collection, right? We know it costs a lot of money, so yeah, not just the content. This is all great. Thank you for sharing. Just as a final kind of quote, again, to keep ourselves thinking, this is from a recent publication that I think might be of interest for a lot of you. It's from Jameson, Decentering Whiteness in Libraries, a framework for inclusive collection management practices. So again, this has a lot of good insight, but also, again, examples and how-to principles for collection development. But she said collection development policies create institutional memory. So when policies are written, they should represent the collective consciousness of an organization. And we saw that not all universities at this point have EDI statements or have good, took a stance on equity, diversity, inclusion, and even less like library and collection development policies mention that. But if we do, like it represents ourselves, it represents the organization, represent our community. So keeping that in mind, I think is quite important. So I really like this quote. I think it's quite inspiring. Yeah, powerful quote. So thank you very much for listening to our session. So we'll close the slides so we can see each other. And we still have 13 minutes to discuss, so this is great. So we'll invite you and we can come back to the question that we presented earlier, or if you want to share any thoughts or question about this work, we'd be happy to discuss.
And here are references really quickly. Thank you.
Yeah.